Hello and welcome to the latest Moneymakers Weekly Investment Trust podcast. I'm Jonathan Davis, the editor of the Investment Trust Handbook, and your host for this weekly review of all the latest news and developments affecting the investment trust sector. My thanks to JP Morgan Asset Management for agreeing to sponsor the podcast, which as a result will now remain free for the foreseeable future. Moneymakers is an independent research and publishing venture with a mission to explain and inform. But I must remind you that for regulatory reasons, nothing you hear from any speaker today should be regarded as constituting individual investment advice. This week we have an election special edition of the podcast in which I will be discussing with three expert guests not so much who is going to win the election, that seems a foregone conclusion, but the more interesting question of how in practice an incoming Labour government with a working majority, and possibly a large one, is likely to behave. What will it prioritise? Is the machinery of government ready to deliver it? How hemmed in will the new government be by fiscal constraints? How important are the first 100 days? And what does it all mean for the financial markets, sterling, gilts and equities? To talk through all these important issues, I'm joined today by Nick Macpherson, Lord Macpherson of Earl's Court, former Permanent Secretary of the Treasury from 2005 to 2016, now a crossbench peer in the House of Lords. Ed Balls, the journalist, broadcaster and former MP and Government Minister, and Sandy Nairn, Executive Director of Global Opportunities Trust, the multi-asset investment trust, who, like all of us, has a particular vested interest in how the election will shape the economic and market environment over the next 5 years. More on that in a moment. This week has continued to be dominated by election campaigns, not just ours, but the US one as well, where the first televised debate between President Joe Biden and ex-President Donald Trump may perhaps have changed the course of the campaign, leading as it has done to calls for Biden to drop out of the race after his disappointing performance, which may or may not turn out to be a big thing for the financial markets as well as the US economy. As it was an up and down week for the equity markets, with the Japanese market putting in another good showing, while the US equity markets were mixed, with the S&P 500 down a fraction when the dust settled, but the Nasdaq up a fraction. While the UK equity market retreated, the all-share down just shy of 1%, and most European markets were down a bit more than that. Most gilt issues, meanwhile, traded down as well, with yields edging higher, while yields on longer-dated US Treasuries also edged higher and gold remained firm at around $2,300. Sterling, meanwhile, barely moved over the course of the week. The Investment Trust Index was down 0.8% on the week, with winners narrowly outnumbered by losers, and the average discount remained little changed at around 15%. The big news of the week has been the proposed tie-up between two of the largest trusts in the global sector, with the Board of Whitton, founded in 1909, having debated a range of options for its future, deciding to merge the trust into the even more venerable Alliance Trust, founded 1888. Assuming the deal is approved by shareholders next month, as seems certain, it will create a £5 billion market cap trust, comparable in size to Alliance's longtime rival F&C, and behind only Scottish Mortgage in size in the global sector. The combined portfolio will be managed with the best ideas multi-manager strategy that has served the shareholders of Alliance Trust well since it was adopted 7 years ago, during which time Whitton's own rather different multi-manager strategy, which was adopted in 2004 with considerable initial success, has fared less well. All the shareholders will benefit from a higher dividend and slightly lower charges, the OCR coming down to just under 0.6%, it's projected, while shareholders in Whitton who want to opt out of the deal will be offered a cash exit at a discount of 2.5% to NAV, capped at 17.5% of the trust's share capital. The combined trust will have no fewer than 10 directors for a while after the deal, which some might suggest is a bit of an overload, but that is merely a minor quibble over what looks to be a logical and sensible outcome, and has been well received by the market, judging by the share price response so far. The combined vehicle will be eligible for inclusion in the FTSE 100 when it completes around the end of the year. This latest deal is certainly a powerful indication of the tide of consolidation and change which continues to sweep through the sector, although it's worth pointing out that both Alliance and Whitton in their current incarnations are themselves the result of board and shareholder pressure for change after earlier periods of disappointing performance. The theme of renewal in tough times is not a new one in investment trust history, and indeed can be seen as one of the reasons for its continued success. Elsewhere, we had results from 17 trusts, the majority of them interim announcements rather than annual figures. Those reporting included 4 specialist trusts: SDCL Energy Efficiency, Triple Point Energy Transition, Harmony Energy Income Trust and Augmentum Fintech, all of which were awarded with positive share price rises, a sign perhaps of improving tolerance for higher risk ventures amongst shareholders. Leading the way among the share price decliners this week was Regional REIT, ticker RGL, the specialist out-of-London office commercial property company, which has been in trouble ever since the pandemic triggered a move to working from home. It's been forced to announce this week a rescue rights issue at just 10p a share, which is a long way short of its most recent stated NAV of 56p a share, and its pre-pandemic high of 120p a share. The issue, which has been underwritten, will raise just over 100 million sterling and will be used to refinance the balance sheet, including paying off a retail bond that it could not otherwise afford to settle without losing its tax-efficient status as a real estate investment trust. The shares have been in free fall for most of this year, but the hope is that the underwritten share issue will set it back on the road to recovery after what has been a near-death experience. Notable too that a number of other commercial property trusts saw their share prices falter this week. As always, you can find all of these results summarised in our latest weekly email for subscribers to the Moneymakers Circle, where this week our in-depth profile features Premier Miton Global Renewables, ticker PMGR. I also comment further, among other things, on the Witten Alliance proposal and the latest update from the UK microcap specialist Rockwood Strategic. You'll also find there a summary of all the latest share price, NAV and discount movements over the past 5 days. Next week also I'll be taking a look back at how the investment trust sector has performed over the course of the first 6 months of this year. On then to the issue of what happens after the expected Labour victory in next Thursday's general election. I kicked off my three-way discussion with my expert guests by asking Ed Balls, who went to work in the Treasury as Gordon Brown's advisor the day after Tony Blair's victory in '97, and Lord Macpherson, who was also in the Treasury overseeing the transition to a new regime after several years as Principal Private Secretary to the outgoing Chancellor Ken Clarke, how the circumstances that will greet Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves compare to 1997 and what the move was like the last time Labour came into power after a long time out of office.
There was definitely a mood of optimism in the country in the weeks before the general election. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, though, were very cautious. They'd been through the pain of the defeat of 1992, where Labour was expected to win. And so even until the very end, I think they were always worried that they might lose. I remember in the couple of days before talking to both of them and then thinking, that we might get to a majority of, 50, 60, 70. So the landslide was really off the scale in terms of their expectations. They were very superstitious about doing anything, not just in public, but even in private, which would look like they were measuring the curtains. And so there's all this conversation about access talks, engagement with the civil service. I had done a year worth of that, really, with the Permanent Secretary, Terry Burns, with Nick Macpherson. Nick and I had met a number of times before the election. Jonathan Powell for Tony Blair. But Tony Blair and Gordon Brown themselves didn't really want to engage in that process at all. It was left to others because they didn't want to preempt what was happening. And then, of course, the economic background was a strengthening economy, an argument between Ken Clarke, the Chancellor, Eddie George, the Governor, in public about interest rates, with Eddie George calling for a rise in interest rates and Ken Clarke resisting. And I think in those days before the election, one of the things which was very uppermost in Gordon Brown's mind was to not get trapped into that kind of public argument with the governor. He had seen the Ken and Eddie show, didn't want to be in an argument with the governor. He knew his history, the arguments that the Wilson government had with Lord Cromer, governor of the Bank of England in the 1960s. And so on the Monday before the election, he said to me, if we're going to go for Bank of England independence, which we had floated 2 years before, hadn't really talked publicly about since, certainly hadn't talked in detail to Nick or to Terry about. We'd given the impression that we'd wait to see the track record of some of the reforms we were putting in place, how that worked. He said, if we're going to do this, we should do it immediately because it will be a big moment. And also we just changed the whole dynamic of the Treasury relationship with the Bank of England. So the honest answer to your question, in those days before, we were very focused on the Bank of England independence decision, how it would work, how we would manage it, how quickly we would do it. That was preoccupying for us, But that was not part of the public conversation at all.
But let me ask you, Nick, as well, your memories of that particular moment. And did that kind of first step help to energise the whole process of the civil service or not? Or were they energised enough already? I guess a change of government is always an interesting moment for a civil service.
Well, you kind of joined the civil service to see transfers in power. By 1997, I'd been in the Treasury for 12 years, and all that time there'd been a Tory government. So I think there was a degree of excitement in May 1997 about the prospect of change, because civil servants, when they go home, are private citizens, and when there's a change of view, they tend to reflect that. But also it was an exciting time because the new government had an exciting agenda. The independence of the Bank of England took us totally by surprise. We pored over the manifesto, produced 300 pages of briefing for the incoming government, none of which I think got read by Gordon Brown, but at least Ed read some of it, I think.
Every page.
Exactly. So the Bank of England independence really was, to use the modern cliche, a game changer. And that was really exciting for the Treasury. In one sense, it meant the Treasury was losing power. The decision to set interest rates was moved over to the Bank of England. But in another sense, I think it actually increased the power of the Treasury, because interest rates were now in the hands of an arm's length body. And that actually strengthened the Treasury in relation to Number 10, who I had seen in the past putting pressure on chancellors, certainly in the Major Lamont era, from Number 10 to cut interest rates. So I think the Treasury was extremely enthusiastic at that point.
Sandy, I'll bring you in here as well. I mean, you're, if you like, representing the markets here. The independence of the Bank of England was indeed a game changer. There were some other things that the new government eventually did that weren't so popular with the markets, particularly related to pension funds. But what are your expectations from this potential new Labour government, and how would that compare to your memories of 1997 when you were managing money?
So I think 97, a lot of the heavy lifting had been done in a fiscal sense, and I think the incoming Labour government obviously followed the policies for a while, but had a lot of latitude because the fiscal position had improved that allowed various expenditures to be embarked on thereafter. And obviously we're in a very different position now, I think. And as Nick said, the announcement of the independence of the Bank of England was a game changer for markets. That was a kind of stamp of approval that you had a government in tune with markets, at least to that degree. I think if we look at markets now, my view is the UK is going to emerge from this as one of the, in a relative sense at least, leaving aside absolute valuations, one of the most attractive markets in the world, because we live in a world of political stress. As everybody knows, there's many elections going on around the world. As far as I can read into what's been put out, the vast majority of the policies being suggested by Labour are both sensible and needed. The leaders seem to be I'm not quite sure what term to use. They're competent, they know what they're doing. So markets are sanguine. And I think that's already reflected, and I'm going to think are going to become more sanguine. I think the big question, which I can't really answer, is that on these policies that are going to be addressing the key long-term structural issues in the economy are going to require a lot of political will and a lot of managerial competence to implement them. And that's why it's so exciting to have Ed and Nick in the call, because they've been in the room and seen them. So my questions are more not about the policies, it's about the implementation, because there's going to be resistance to them from all sorts of areas when they come to be implemented. So generally, I think markets are going to be positive in the changes, and then it's how do they actually get implemented?
Well, that's always the big question, of course. I mean, you're right to point out the pound is steady. The gilts have barely moved for several months. Interest rates haven't come down, but they haven't gone up. Inflation is down to target 2%. FTSE, God bless it, is even at an all-time high since recently. But at the same time, gold is also at a high. So there's some concerns out there about many things. Ed, Sandy's question about implementation. Obviously, we know that Sue Gray, who is a former cabinet official, has been working very hard with the Labour team. Do you think that implementation is an issue that they fully grasp?
I think back in 1997, almost nobody had been in government, government minister, an advisor. I think Margaret Beckett had been a junior minister in the late 1970s. That was it. And I think that the new Labour ministers were respectful of the civil service and their expertise, and also knew what they didn't know. And there was quite a lot of caution. So if you take the way in which we went around about the first spending review, we did a whole comprehensive review, which didn't report until the summer of 1998, a year later. There was a big overhaul of the macro fiscal framework, but the first significant budget in macro fiscal terms didn't really happen until the spring of 1998. The early budget was important and did the windfall tax, a couple of other things. But in terms of setting the macro fiscal frame, and then in terms of structural reform, there were certain things which we were quick to move on. David Blunkett had a plan for testing in schools, but in the health service, there was a lot of caution. In the Treasury, the growth agenda, which became to be a very important part of the kind of Gordon Brown Treasury. I mean, in the early period, there was a lot of analysis. We had McKinsey to come in to do a study for us about kind of obstacles to growth in the UK, in particular looking on kind of structures and planning. And that really happened over the first year. And when you look at the Tony Blair biography, he wrote his biography 15 years later and said, how much he regretted he hadn't moved more quickly. And David Cameron and George Osborne read this book and thought to themselves, he must be right. We must learn the lessons from Tony Blair. We should go more quickly. And actually, a lot of the structural reforms that the Conservatives put in place in 2010 turned out to be very problematic. They ended up rowing back a long way, whether it was small things like privatising the forests or big things like the Lansley reforms. And so I would expect there to be that kind of caution and that understanding that they don't really know everything. The difference is that for macro fiscal reasons, the imperative to move quickly on the growth side is much stronger. Because as Nick said and as Sandy said, growth was strengthening. I mean, people won't remember this, but in 1997, when we came in the first budget, one of the first things we did was we downgraded the trend rate of growth. We said to the NAO, we want to have a lower trend rate of growth in the fiscal assumptions, which they sanctioned. We reduced trend growth so that worsened the fiscal position because we wanted to show we were cautious and prudent and careful. And we didn't revise it up again for a few years. We downgraded it from 2.5% to 2.25%. Now, today, in 2024, I mean, any government would dream of 2.25%. And it's like astonishing. We're now talking about at least a full percentage point lower than that. So although we were being cautious, we were doing so at a time when the underlying fiscal position, because of the growth position, was strong and strengthening. I think that the problem for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves on the growth side is that the imperative to move more quickly is going to be much, much greater, which is why Sandy's right to worry about some of these implementation issues. And I think there's also a political point, which is, the Conservative Party is going to go into a kind of complicated state if it loses. But if you have the rise of reform, I think when we won in 1997, we, from the beginning, were thinking to ourselves, we need a two-term strategy. The 2001 election was like a staging post. You could think about what you were doing for health or education or for growth, thinking over an 8-year horizon. And part of that caution, part of the fact that we were moving slowly was because we thought that we could buy credibility through taking our time, which would then allow us to do more later. The big move on the health service, the national insurance tax rise for the health service came in 2002, so 5 years into the government. I'm not sure whether politically, aside from the growth dynamics, Keir Starmer will feel confident that he has that amount of time. And there was always a sort of a worry on the Labour side, is this going to be Ramsay MacDonald all over again? Are these guys going to betray our ambitions and our hopes and end up being very, very cautious? And even if you've got a big majority, the politics of betrayal is always in the minds of Labour. But if you've got a Reform Party, they're ready to snap up from the right disgruntled Labour voters, while at the same time the Greens are doing that from the left, is tougher. So I'm not sure they will feel as able to be as long-termist as we were able to feel in 1997.
What are your thoughts about that, Nick? I mean, obviously the civil service is very important in implementing whatever governments want to do. Does it help how cautious they are or how perhaps overambitious they might be? What's the ideal state of mind for this far as the civil service is concerned?
I think this is a key strategic question. The difference from 97 is, first, the revenues really only started flowing in 96, 97, 98, which really helped in terms of subsequent fiscal decisions. And also, because the Chancellor still was responsible for the forecast, he could revise down the growth assumptions, get a worse outcome to make it easier further down the track to forecast better outcomes. This time you've got the Independent Office for Budgetary Responsibility. So there isn't the option of saying, I've opened the books and they're terrible, because the books are already open. So, look, I agree with Ed in one sense that the incoming government will be acutely aware that the only way it can get the space to do what it wants is by increasing the rate of economic growth. History suggests that's incredibly difficult. I mean, we all know the drivers of productivity, things like public investment, skills, competition, innovation, a sensible tax system. But we also know that if you implement the right policies in those areas, it takes literally years before you see an increase in the underlying rate of growth. Now, that doesn't mean they can't do things in the short run. I mean, if I was still there, I would be encouraging them to come up with a public investment program which is really growth friendly. I don't think the markets would mind at all if they were to borrow rather more than the current government is planning to do. But they also need to put in place some vigorous, in a sense, delivery plans for things like skills, which are less about actually introducing new policies. It's about being consistent and driving forward progress, not just from Whitehall, but working closely with regions, local authorities, the other nations of the United Kingdom. That's all quite boring. You don't get much political credit for being competent, but it's going to be really important. I think there's probably an opportunity because in recent years, government has been so incoherent. Actually, the whole British system of governance is just longing for someone to take a longer-term view and get a grip.
Well, I'm sure those in the financial markets would agree with that. Of course, the shadow of the sort of Truss episode hangs over everybody, and I think the Institute of Fiscal Studies said this week that essentially the incoming government faces a trilemma. It can raise taxes, it can cut public spending, or it can miss its debt target as a percentage of GDP. So it's going to be a tough call, and I'm not sure how the markets will react to that, how quickly they will decide that it isn't working or it is working. Do you think that there actually is need for reform of the Treasury and the economic management system? That goes back a long time with Labour. We had the whole George Brown, Harold Wilson thing many years ago. Is the Treasury should it be looking after the books and also doing all the supply side stuff? Ed, do you have a thought about that first of all? And I'll come back to you, Nick.
So I think that the successful chancellors of the last 40 years have been chancellors who both took seriously their responsibilities as a narrow finance ministry and a broader economic ministry. And often the failures are when the finance ministry side doesn't quite work as well as you wanted. So you could debate, the Lawson mishandling of shadowing the Deutschmark, and could Gordon Brown have foreseen the macro implications of building financial crisis, and did George Osborne end up doing permanent damage to growth through austerity? But if you think of their big reforms, Lawson, privatisation, corporate tax reform, Gordon Brown, independent competition policy, big drive around science and innovation, George Osborne, the Northern Powerhouse and combined authorities and mayors, they were economic ministry reforms. And in the 1960s, Harold Wilson tried to have a growth plan from a different department than the Treasury, the Department of Economic Affairs, with George Brown, and it utterly failed and ended up being abolished because it didn't work. So either the Treasury is a finance and economics ministry, or you don't have an economics ministry. What you are not going to succeed in doing is doing it outside the Treasury. It's never worked and it won't work. And so I think that Rachel Reeves will absolutely see her job as being finance ministry and economics ministry. Interestingly, I think the legacy of the Truss period is I think she will be very orthodox macro-wise. And so I think there is no way post-Liz Truss that any chancellor, Labour or Conservatives, in the next 5 to 10 years is going to start saying bank independence is a bad idea. Shall we loosen the inflation target? Shall we sack the permanent secretary on day one? And similarly, I think that the commitment to fiscal rules, and in particular having national debt on a falling path, I think that will be big in her mind because of what happened with Liz Truss. And so when Nick says that she could have flexibility, and that the markets would allow some flexibility. And I've seen lots of market participants saying the same thing, to allow borrowing for investment and an upward path for debt GDP. That may well be right. But I think Rachel Reeves herself will be very, very cautious about going it alone as one country trying to embark upon that path. And that is why this growth plan is so hard. Because if you look at the trajectory for public investment, it falls as a percentage of GDP through the next parliament. So Labour's growth plan is going to have falling public investment as a percentage of GDP. Where's the growth in that? But to break out of that with a rising debt path as a percentage of GDP, I think that will be beyond what she will be willing to do. So therefore, the tension for her between being the finance minister and the economics ministry leader will be probably more acute than it was for Gordon Brown or Nigel Lawson.
I'll come back to you, Sandy, in a moment about whether the market would tolerate higher debt and so on, and how much. But Nick, do you want to comment on that issue around the Treasury, where you spent so many years, and whether there's a case for structural reform and the dilemmas that it creates if you don't?
I mean, you can break up the Treasury, and from time to time, people come up with clever ideas to do it. And I mean, there's nothing intrinsically about the Treasury which requires it to carry on in its current structure. Other countries do these things differently. If I was still there, I would advise against it, not just because I spent so much time at the Treasury. It's largely that rearranging deck chairs carries a heavy cost. People have to reapply for their jobs and so on. I think the most important thing is actually how the government is led from the top in terms of the approach the Prime Minister sets out. And then the relationship with the Chancellor is important. I'm quite certain that Rachel Reeves will want to beef up the economics ministry role. But as Ed says, in the end, the government's got to retain fiscal credibility. With the level of debt we have now, the consequences of funding costs rising are just too horrific for words, because they just eat into any available resources which you might want to spend on priority programs. And I'd agree with Ed on the point that I spent most of my career crying wolf about fiscal profligacy. Usually I was proved wrong. But I think when I joined the Treasury, the IMF crisis of 76 was still the event which was etched on every senior Treasury official's memory. And I think the Truss debacle will ensure that Treasury financial orthodoxy remains pretty unchanged for a good 10 to 20 years.
Sandy, Ed was saying that he expected Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer to be relatively cautious in terms of public spending regime and so on.
Particularly the debt GDP path. I think they will want a falling debt GDP ratio, which Nick had said maybe the markets would be accommodating to. That was the thing I was saying particularly that they would be cautious about.
Do you think that's right, Sandy?
Yeah, I guess I do in two different ways. One of them is that a nudge here or there on the path of debt, I don't think makes any difference to growth, or will make very little difference to growth. And I think for me, the most interesting part, although the markets may not alight on it at the moment, I mean, Nick's comments are well taken. You know, you can cause a lot of issues if you get out of step with everybody else, although, you know, it'll be interesting to see what happens to, for example, the Fed's independence post the presidential election. But I think the things that, you know, when we started talking about what Labour had identified as some of the issues on health, on planning, on housing, they do take a long time. But, you know, to me, these really are structural issues. And I think everybody knows you can't fund the health service the way it's required with the demographics going the way they are. And therefore, you need very much a focus on the supply side, not in the kind of historic connotations of the supply side of reducing wages and all the things that go with that, but on enhancing skills and health. And they take a long time to come through, and addressing the issues in the planning system, of which the examples are manifest. You know, when you've got house prices at 8 times income, you've got got all the social issues and personal issues that come from that. So I don't think a nudge here or there on the fiscal side addresses what needs to be done and where there is a potential opportunity to do it. So that's not where I would be looking, and where the markets eventually, I think, will look, is how do you deal with productivity? How do you improve the labour force? How do you get better fit? How do you improve health? How can you use technology to do those things? How can you take the restrictions away? I mean, just to forgive me, just one example on the issue of the green theme, which I've mentioned to you before, Jonathan, is a company I'm involved with. Clean technology, proven, already being used as tidal energy. From first discussion to deployment, Canada, 2 years, UK, 10 to 12. You can't make a difference on those things unless you can take away the impediments. And it's not just planning, it's the interaction of that and other things. And I think that goes, to my mind, to the managerial question of actually implementing and making the changes that allow productivity growth to come through.
Yeah, that is a challenge. Ed, I'm very happy to get your comments on that. I just wanted to throw one extra thought about that, which is, I read through the Labour manifesto, and there does seem to be a tension between, on the one hand, it wants to be a dynamic strategic government, but at the same time it says that government's too centralised and it wants to devolve to local authorities and local areas in many ways. And that strikes at the heart of the sort of planning issue, does it not, to a large extent? What do you think this government can do as far as those issues that Sandy's raised?
Well, let's take planning first. The one thing that you can say about this manifesto, if Labour wins a majority, is that unlike 1997 or 2010, where you had kind of chancellors who subsequently talked about planning reform or house building, but where it didn't really figure in a strong way in the manifesto or the pre-election debate. I mean, they will have a mandate. They have been very clear that they're about the builders, not the blockers. If you have a majority in Parliament, you also have a manifesto which says this is what you are going to do. And so I would expect them to have political impetus to move faster on planning. But there's a few caveats on that, or things to think about. First of all, it's one thing to say to deliver our green plans, we're going to speed up green planning decisions. That's not the same as building houses. And building houses is also something which we desperately need. And I'm not sure the mandate is as strong on house building as it is on the green issues that Sandy just spoke about. Secondly, the size of the majority matters here in some ways in a slightly perverse way. I mean, it is absolutely clear if the majority is bigger, that gives Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves more power and mandate in Parliament to resist pressure on macro-fiscal policy. But if the majority is bigger, there'll be a lot more members of Parliament who are Labour, who'll be worrying about their seat at the next election, who have the kind of constituencies as I had in 2010 and 2015 on the edge of a conurbation. I was on the edge of Leeds and Bradford by the M62, on the edge of the Green Belt, where all of these political issues around planning and house building and land use really bite. And if you are an inner city Labour MP, then the politics of that is much more comfortable. If Labour ends up with a bigger majority and therefore lots of members of Parliament for whom that is much more acute, actually, in some ways, the bigger majority makes things a little bit harder. The next caveat is about the relationship between public spending and planning. Because, I remember this back in 1997, the conversation about speeding up the planning system. It's not just about political will or the legislative framework, it's also about capacity. And if you go through a period where you cut back spending in local government, as we have done now for over a decade, the money which goes to children's services is sustained. And the money which goes to care for the elderly is sustained, although it's under pressure. But the place where the axe falls is on these things which are much less visible to the public. And so I would say that the capacity within local government to make planning decisions, house building or business decisions is much less than it would have been 10, 20, 30, 50 years ago. And so it's all very well to say we're going to speed up the planning system, but if you haven't got the people with the expertise and the experience to actually do it, you end up with very, very long waits, not because of political will, but just because of a lack of administrative capacity. And at the moment, in the public spending plans, local government is unprotected. They're facing, as the IFS would say, real-term cuts in public spending throughout the next Parliament. If Rachel Reeves wants planning to be a priority, she's got to spend more money on local government planning capacity, which is going to cost. And that is one of those spending dilemmas she'll have to face very quickly. And then the final one is your point about local authorities and mayors. I have urged Rachel and Labour, I've urged the Conservatives as well, to go further and faster on the combined authorities and mayors, and in particular to move the big decision-making or kind of the final decision-making, the power to knock heads together and sort it to the mayoral level. Because at the mayoral level, with an individual mandate and an imperative around economics and jobs and growth, it's easier to break out of very local planning blockages. But so far, that's not happened. I mean, the combined authority mayors in Manchester and Birmingham don't really have those planning powers. They do a bit more in London. Will Rachel Reeves, as a Labour Chancellor, think my growth imperative means I'm going to put all that stuff around devolution and mayors on the back burner? Or will she think the only way to deliver on skills and planning is to really drive through those structural reforms which empower local individual mandate leaders to make those planning decisions? I don't know what the answer to that is. But if it was me, I would think I've got more chance of driving through some of these big reforms than with an elected mayor with a mandate than I will have by simply trying to run the current system. But, there is a counter argument to that the mayors will be very small C Conservative figures. I'm not so sure.
Nick, what are your perspective on all that? Because it is obviously a crucial part of this whole discussion we're having about what the Labour government can actually achieve.
I think planning is a really interesting early test. Every government I worked for said it was reforming the planning system to make it easier to build. The impact has been very small so far. Now, maybe this time it will be different. And it's really important it is, because it really goes to the heart of the efficiency of government. To build a mile of motorway in Britain cost twice as much as in France. And the last time I looked, 5 times as much as in Spain. And that's because of a whole lot of planning constraints, the need to build tunnels and so on. And this runs very deep in British culture. Everybody wants good motorways, they want more housing, but not where they are. And even Sandy's tidal energy, there will be local inhabitants somewhere in some islands in the Orkney who will be dead against it. So, look, this is an early test. If they can't make progress on this, they've got a problem. But I think, again, it comes back to competence. At least they know what they need to do. And there are enough people left over from the 97-2010 cabinet, Ed Miliband and Yvette Cooper, to name but 2. I know Ed couldn't mention the latter, who kind of need to be really influential within cabinet about how you make things happen in government, because it is not easy. It's not about just pulling a lever. You need to work across government and across central, local and devolved governments.
Could I maybe come back, Jonathan, just a thought? As Ed said, as important as the green energy is, housing is equally, if not more important, given all the impacts on labour markets and people's thinking about assets. And to your original question about how might markets react to a bit more debt, I think if the debt was phrased as this debt is being raised to allow us to make structural improvements on the supply side, naming what the issues were, that to me the market, whether they would, but I think they should welcome it, because it's an issue that just year after year, for all the political reasons, and I'm naive in politics, I've never had any involvement, so what seems easy and obvious from the outside clearly isn't when you're actually trying to implement it. But if we're going to get productivity up, these are the things that have to be addressed.
Can I then move on to another question, which is one that has occupied a lot of the headlines? Do you think that the Labour Party has been wise to rule out any tax increases on the lines it has, and not answered perhaps as carefully as they might on things like capital gains tax and inheritance tax? That's obviously been an important election campaign issue. First of all, why has the Labour Party gone that way? And do you think that's a wise move, given that it's probably inevitable that some taxes will have to go up?
Well, I think from the very first debate, pretty much the only thing that the Prime Minister has wanted to talk about is the £2,000 that he says per household Labour is going to raise taxes by. And I think that's the answer to your question about why a Labour leadership, which has been out of power for 14 years, knowing that that would be the attack from Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt, decided to double down and put up their defences and to fight that and resist that as hard as they could. And, the IFS says there is a conspiracy of silence. that no party is facing up to the nature of the fiscal and public spending challenges, and that if you look into the plans, which the OBR said are not even really a work of fiction, let alone reality, it's hard to square them with the pressures on the NHS and social care, or defence in a dangerous world, or the kind of economic growth imperative, which we've just been talking about. But politics has decided, kind of driven by those tax attacks, to shut this down. And that's where we are. And they have made much stronger commitments, the Labour opposition, than Labour made in 1997. But I think if you win thinking, I've got 10 years, then you might be casual about the commitments you made in your manifesto. But at a time when politics is lurching in the way it is, I mean, in 2019, Boris Johnson won a majority of 100 in the red wall seats. In the spring of 2022, he was miles ahead in the polls, and Keir Starmer was thinking about resigning. And suddenly we are lurching across to this potential for a big Labour majority. If you're Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves and thinking it could lurch back, they won't be thinking about 10 years. They'll be thinking about the first Parliament and the next manifesto. And the one thing they will not want to do is go into the next election telling all the people who decided in this election to vote for them in the red wall seats, we broke our promises on tax, but it was worth it. So I think that the right political conclusion is to take these promises seriously. But I think that just makes things very, very hard indeed. Nick and I have done over the years so many budgets, including so many budgets together. And in opposition, it can be very hard to find a credible £500 million. And in government, it's easier to find £500 million when you're going through the macro fiscal numbers and they're up to a budget. But it's really hard to find £2.5 billion. It's very hard to find 5. And it's very, very hard to find 10. And once you're in the 2.5, 5, 10, you're in a world where people will notice. And you're in a world where the idea that this is simply being paid for by the rich or the wealthy, I mean, it's just not how it works. And so I think it is very hard for Labour to break out of the fiscal straitjacket they put themselves in through small, not noticed taxes, which only affect the rich. Oh, and by the way, we have an economics ministry which thinks they want a growth plan, and the growth plan has got to be coherent with their tax policy, and a tax policy which looks like is clobbering people who are taking risks around business investment, but that's not a growth plan at all. So I think that this is a very big fiscal dilemma for Labour and a growth dilemma. And I think it means that the public spending pressures are going to be acute for some time in this Parliament.
If you're a Treasury official, you spend your whole life wanting, to use the cliche, a grown-up conversation about the public finances, where governments set out in their manifestos sensible tax increases and sensible tax reforms, but that's simply not going to happen. I think the Labour Party is being influenced by the 1992 election, where John Smith did try and set out a plan, and they got clobbered by the electorate. The one thing I would say, which actually relates to Ed's point, is I really wouldn't worry too much about things like capital gains tax or inheritance tax. There isn't any money in them. We're pretty close to the optimal rate of revenue maximising CGT. Last time I looked at it, it was, I think, 28%. So anybody who's worrying that it's suddenly going to go up to 40%, or that the government's going to suddenly clamp down on farmers when it comes to inheritance tax, it's simply not going to happen, because those special interest groups shout very loudly and you just make enemies you don't need to make. So it does come back to Ed's point. If they need large amounts of revenue, you've got to go for the big taxes. The problem is that they've ruled out the big changes in the big taxes. In the end, I think a bit of creativity is required. I don't think they'll probably get there in the first Parliament, but I've been a long advocate of a health and social care levy, which would be based on something like the income tax or national insurance base. And indeed, Mr. Sunak introduced one, because actually the problems we're dealing with are fundamentally demographic. There's a reason the tax burden's going up. We've got more old people, and those old people expect decent pensions and so on. So in the end, the tax thing will have to be addressed. I'm probably a bit more optimistic than Ed that the government can borrow a little more, but I don't think you can borrow much more, and it all hinges on what other governments are doing. I happen to think Britain will look like a beacon of stability in the coming period compared to others. But I find the tax scare stories of the general election campaign slightly implausible. I mean, whoever forms the next government in the end is probably going to end up with a higher tax burden than we had 20 years ago, but that is totally inevitable. Well, I think Ed referred to national security and defence. The fact is we got a massive Cold War dividend, and the times of getting savings from the defence budget are well and truly over. So big challenges, but you're not going to solve these problems by taxing the rich, as Sandy can probably tell you from his experience of living in Scotland.
So I have to bring Scotland into this at some point, yes.
I think the other thing, Jonathan, is if it's a conspiracy of silence, it's a global conspiracy. It's probably the only global conspiracy I would subscribe to, because virtually every developed country in the world faces exactly the same issues.
Indeed they do. One other question I wanted to ask, because it's political, and I welcome your views on this. What do you think, in practice, a Labour government will do, given we talked about the supply side issues, we talked about issues in health service and so on. What in practice do you think the incoming government can or should do about immigration? Because it is such a political topic. Population is growing, as we know, putting more pressure on housing and so on. How do you think a Labour government could approach this, and can they resolve it, come to a clear, sensible policy on immigration?
I think there are two issues here. One is immigration and the other is asylum. And the two things get totally conflated because of the small boat issue. I mean, look, whoever forms the next government, I suspect will rapidly end the Rwanda scheme and focus on a sort of hard-headed approach to small boats. But the bigger issue, I think, and more interesting issue economically is immigration. And you've got to look at this through many different lenses. There's higher education and students who count against the immigration figures but tend to go back home at the end of it. There's skilled labour and so on. I think the politics of immigration is such that whoever wins the election is going to have to clamp down quite hard on just numbers, the net numbers coming into the country. And that does make delivering on growth, less so GDP per head, more difficult. But I don't think it's probably sustainable to have net immigration of 750,000 people a year. I think any government will want to get that figure down if it's going to get re-elected.
Do you have a view on that?
So there were particular issues with Ukraine and Hong Kong, which meant there was a big boost in the immigration numbers, and those one-off factors will not continue, and therefore the numbers are going to come down. So that will help. Secondly, there was a bulge in migration in the numbers, particularly around social care, which is quite striking, because this is not kind of skilled migration coming from around the world. This is a reflection of the sorry state of social care in our country and the way in which we structure and pay and manage the social care workforce. And you would think that is something a reforming government would want to sort out. But if you have an economics ministry orientated Treasury dealing with independent Office of Budget Responsibility forecasts, the one thing which will make your life very hard in growth and macro fiscal terms is a hugely restrictive approach to legal migration in economically useful and important areas, which are now in the control of the UK, because post-Brexit, we can manage this in the way in which we want. So I would expect there to be quite a strong push from the Treasury and the centre to make sure that that growth through economically good migration carries on. That depends on the credibility, as Nick said, of the way in which you go about protecting your borders. Because if you don't have a credible approach to managing the borders and to asylum and to the small boats, that then knocks across into your ability to sustain sensible economic migration. So if you're the Treasury and you think that the good parts of economic migration, which, would be consensual between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, should carry on, then you've got to sort out in a more effective way what you're doing around illegal migration, and in particular the processing of asylum claims. Massive backlog, huge amounts of money now being spent on people who are just sitting within the system. So I would expect the Treasury will have to focus on resourcing that, and that the government will have to make, the new government, if it's a Labour government, will have to make some pretty tough decisions around the way in which it manages that backlog and the way in which it polices the channel. And as Nick says, Rwanda will go, but you have to have an alternative deterrent in place. And that has to become about the strength of your border management and your asylum management. And at the moment, for all the Rwanda rhetoric, in fact, it's been incredibly lax and massively expensive. And that's what they've got to sort out. Back in 97, we had a huge asylum backlog. And in the end, that was the politically contentious thing. And it was reduced, but it takes a long time and it is really expensive. But if you don't do it, then your ability to run the legal economic migration system well is hugely curtailed.
Okay, so we're coming to the end of our time. So I wanted to just finish perhaps by asking you, I guess if I can put this way, your best expectations of what might happen after the election and the biggest risk that you think might derail them. Obviously, events is obviously high on that list, and who knows what could be happening on the international stage in particular. But why don't I start with you, Sandy, if I may, if you have expectations and what you think you're most worried about.
In a sense, Ed and Nick have kind of already addressed my biggest fear, that what we need to do takes a long time. It takes a lot of thought. It takes a bit of resource. And there's going to be repeating opposition in various places to it. And the fear would be that some of these structural changes, whether it's in planning or procurement and all the things that eventually help the supply side of the economy work more efficiently, get overtaken by various forms of either events or politics. That's the fear. The hope is that the majority is of, I'm not quite sure what the right number would be, but a number that allows these things to actually get implemented, and with an opposition, or what will become an opposition likely to be in disarray for a while, there's an opening to actually get these things done to the benefit of the economy because it's so desperately needed. So the fears and the hopes are actually the same thing. The additional fear is what happens out with the borders of the other elections that are taking place, and trade policy and all the things that, there isn't time to discuss just now, but where the path to kind of fragmenting of global trade is, you can see the path, but you hope it doesn't come. But that's another dialogue. So the hopes and fears are the same thing. The hope is that the government comes in and is able to do what it's suggested it is going to do.
Nick, I'll come to you next.
Well, my hope is based on my view that for all the negativity about the British economy, actually it's proven remarkably resilient in dealing with shocks over the last 15 years or so. And that if we can just get a reasonably stable international trade environment, actually we could just see the British economy growing a little faster. Britain could look like a beacon of stability in an uncertain world, with a government with a reasonable majority, reasonably sensible policies. My fear is that in a world of increasing protection and unpredictability, the global situation deteriorates, and Britain, being a very open economy, will suffer. That will reduce the government's room for manoeuvre, and we will get into rather nasty downward spiral for the public finances, which will lead to disillusion and disappointment.
We might have to talk about sterling again, yes. So Ed, I'll finish with you. Obviously you have a view about this. What are your realistic expectations and fears?
Well, look, I'm very struck by Sandy and Nick's optimism about the UK as beacon of stability. And if you look at what's going to be happening in America, potentially in France, political weakness in Germany, there is an opportunity here for the UK to look like it can actually manage and run its affairs. And there is a bonus, a premium in that. And there are things that, short of, I don't think there's any possibility of the next Labour government rejoining the customs union, let alone the single market, let alone the European Union. But there's things which can be done to get to a better way in which Britain engages with its main trading partners around the world. I think my worry is more internal and political. And it goes back to the point I made about whether or not the time horizons are going to be shortened. If you think about this election, big issues, the cost of living and the National Health Service. Now, the cost of living pressure will ease because of what's happening to energy prices, because inflation is going to come down. But the fundamental question, am I getting better off? Are my wages rising? is going to be there. And then secondly, when Labour came in 97, we were kind of worrying about waiting lists in the National Health Service where long waits were over 1 million. Today we are talking about wait lists which are over 7 million. It's a much more kind of acute challenge in the National Health Service. And there are things which Labour can do to drive a growth agenda, which is the way to break out of the kind of spending dilemmas and helps on jobs as well as the National Health Service. But that is going to take time. And I think they are going to take a very orthodox approach to the macroeconomy and tax. But there is going to be a lot of pressure because independent of the caution of the manifesto, and independent of the fact that it doesn't feel like 1997 in terms of hype and excitement, expectations will be very high for what a new government can do around jobs and living standards and around the National Health Service. And if they can't deliver on those things, then the political pressure starts to grow quite quickly. And who knows what will happen to the Conservative opposition? Who knows what will happen to reform? But we might be facing an election in a few years' time, which is tough. So I think that my fear is that it will be hard for this government to meet expectations in the way in which they need to do. But that in the end comes down to leadership. It's whether you can open the books, explain the dilemmas and show people you've got a plan and you're implementing it in a sensible way over a number of years and take people with you. And so the political communication leadership challenge of winning this election, I think, is more acute than 1997. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were exceptional political leaders, but Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are going to have to be bigger and better.
So that brings us to the end of this discussion of the likely impact of a Labour victory in the general election next week, should that be the outcome, as the polls clearly suggest. The results will, of course, be known by the time we put out next week's edition, so I look forward to discussing that, and of course the latest news from the investment trust sector in a week's time. By when we may also have a better idea of how the fallout from the first Trump-Biden debate in the US election campaign has affected the outlook for that important election coming up in November. These are interesting times indeed.
Thank you for listening. The Moneymakers Weekly Investment Trust podcast is independently produced and edited and is listed on all leading podcast channels. You can also sign up at the website money-makers.co to be notified every time a new podcast is available. Please note these podcasts are provided for educational purposes only, and nothing you have heard from any of the speakers should be regarded as constituting investment advice. If you want more news, analysis, interviews and other investment trust content, don't forget to look at the Moneymakers Circle, available now for a modest subscription at the website.